Okay, good evening, everybody. You probably heard most of this little chatter going on, so good evening and welcome. And usually, I introduce the speaker, but tonight we've got a lot of people on, and we have we have quite a few questions. And I'm going to let Dr. Pantilat introduce himself, and we can get right into his presentation. So, Dr. Pantilat, up to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy, for inviting me. And it's my pleasure to join you this evening to talk to you about the use of music and rhythm as medicine for people with Parkinson disease. My name is Alex Pantilat. I'm an associate professor of neurology at Johns Hopkins. And relevant to this presentation tonight, I direct the Johns Hopkins Center for Music and Medicine. My disclosures are here. The relevant disclosures at the top. I'm a scientific advisory board member for MedRhythms, and we're going to be discussing one of their products, which recently, well, this year went live and is now something that your movement disorders neurologist can prescribe to you. So we'll go into that in a little bit of detail. So to give you an outline for our talk, I'll speak about generally how music impacts the brain, what functions of the brain, what networks are being activated when we hear music, when we move to music, when we clap to music. We're going to talk about several types of music-based interventions, treatments that are available, and I'll give you a couple of examples of our past projects, tell you a little bit about what we're working on, and most importantly, the part I always look forward to the most for every presentation is take your questions. For those who have to leave early, this is something I learned over the course of giving these talks. I'm going to give you my high-level take-home points of how, practically speaking, you can incorporate music, dance, movement to rhythm into your life to make it better and improve your quality of life. I'm going to show this slide now, and then I'm going to show it again at the end. So if you have to disconnect, if you don't have the time or the motivation to listen to the rest of the talk, this is a take-home slide. What can you do tonight, tomorrow to actually improve your quality of life using music? March to music that you enjoy. That's the essence of the Moviv device that MedRhythms has actually cleared through the Food and Drug Administration. It is now looks like covered by Medicare. You could get it 3 months at a time, and you could actually walk with a device, assessing your walking parameters and adjusting the music on your own individualized playlist. But short of that device, you could just use Spotify and your smartphone, Pandora, your favorite music, in your iPhone, and play a playlist and march. Pick something that's got a nice strong 1-2-1-2 beat. Create a playlist or take one of the myriad playlists available online and march to music that you actually like. If you do that, starting at 5 minutes a day, build up to 10 minutes. Eventually, if you get closer to 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, you'll be replicating essentially what we did in the tempo trial that I'll tell you about later on. So you can do this now, and you don't need a device, but the device might make it a little bit more motivating. You could enroll in a dance class. You've heard, hopefully, about Dance for PD. I heard Judy, before people logged on, tell me about a very exciting development. MAPS is supporting a dance class for people with Parkinson disease, arguably the strongest evidence for music and rhythm-based rehabilitation in Parkinson disease is for dance. Those who start doing twice a week Argentine tango, ballroom dancing, they get better in terms of their walking, balance, and overall motor symptoms of Parkinson disease. And as long as they sustain the twice a week, 60-minute classes, that's been studied from Washington University, St. Louis, they retain the improvement at 2 years. So while the study that showed this was small, it was published over 10 years ago, there aren't actually all that many studies, even for drugs, approved treatments for Parkinson disease that are 2 years out or longer. Most studies don't follow people out that long, and at 2 years to have sustained benefit without a decline in a progressive disease like Parkinson disease is actually a pretty big deal. The key is, of course, having the motivation and the ability to come to the classes and sustain them. That's where the MAPS class and other classes come in. You could join a choir. Once again, we got the Parkin Songbirds, right? We have the Parkinsonics as well, which is a virtual choir, which began finally this year to have some in-person meetings as well. And I'll talk about what we did to establish the Parkinsonics a few slides ahead. You could dust off your old guitar, violin, or piano and pick up a musical instrument and learn. If you want to really challenge yourself just generally, learning a brand new musical instrument or learning to sing is one of the top challenges for your brain. I'll show you why in a second. But picking up something that you maybe played in your youth and put down and taking some new lessons. YouTube has lessons for free. You could take lessons, obviously, in person as well. An instructor, that is one of the best things overall that you could do for your brain. And in the face of Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, that's now pretty clearly recognized as a way to fend off, the accumulation, the buildup of proteins in the brain. They'll keep building up, but you could actually ward off your symptoms by years by picking up something like a musical instrument and actually practicing it regularly. And last but not least, consider seeing a music therapist. We could talk more about that if interested in the Q&A, but what I learned over the last 12 years or so working with my music therapy colleagues is there's a very wide range of what a music therapist does. And some of that depends on his or her training, but generally on the one end of the spectrum, they could be your therapist. So literally they talk and they're a therapist, if you think about a talk therapist or a psychotherapist, and at times they may use music where words perhaps cannot reach you, cannot penetrate. That's where music can come in. There are myriad examples of that too. And that's on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, it's a very behavioral kind of thing where a music therapist does what a physical therapist does, except by using music. So you could march to metronome beat. That's similar to what I said at the beginning, right? A music therapist could help you find the optimal beat because everybody's got their own preferred best case march beat, your own tempo, right? You want to beat to march to your own drummer. So music therapists could help you with that. Our music therapists do that, among other things, through our center. And there are also support groups that our music therapists run. So these are free online support groups that you could join. And I'm happy to share my email, and that way you could get on the list and get the Zoom link on a monthly basis. So that's all I'll say about the action steps. That was the take home for the entire presentation. So as far as our center, our vision, it's a dual vision, music as medicine, medicine for musicians. Our mission is to bring music and medicine together by making music and rhythm an integral part of healthcare and also by improving the health of musicians around the world. So in that last part, we partner with Peabody and with other like-minded physical medicine and rehabilitation physicians, other neurologists around the world to establish what we hope will be a new subspecialty, a sports medicine or occupational medicine of professional and serious musicians. Because right now it doesn't exist. It's not the same as sports medicine. And finally, there's movement over the last 5 years or so to establish a bona fide new medical subspecialty, which is going to specifically treat musicians' injuries and occupational illness. Our team consists of music therapists, physicians, nurses, a nurse practitioner, and physical, occupational, and speech therapists. And our website is down below. I'm happy to share slides from this presentation with those who are interested as well. So now we're going to delve into some of the science. So how does music actually impact our body? How does it impact our brain? Well, one thing that's very clear is that like any other type of stimulus, incoming stimulus, in this case, is something that you either play, sing, or you actually hear music through your headphones or just on the speakers. It leads to increased regional activity in the brain. That means our brain is full of electricity. It fires in certain predictable patterns in response to music. And what that leads to within seconds is increased blood flow to the parts of the brain that are firing. Because in order to sustain firing, you need more blood flow. That's how the brain works fundamentally. And a key axis, a key interconnected system between the brain and the rest of the body that music can impact is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis for short. That axis ultimately acts on the adrenal cortex, the adrenal glands above the kidneys, to release our stress hormone cortisol. And so study after study, going back decades, looking at cortisol levels in the blood and cortisol levels in our saliva, show that music that most of us would consider calming, that's music that's instrumental, that has a tempo, a pace that approximates a resting heart rate, 50 to 60 beats, 65 or so beats per minute, that doesn't have too much variation, too many ups and downs in its loudness, in the frequency, the tone variation. In other words, kind of on the boring side, depending on how you're feeling at that moment. That's the kind of music that relaxes most of us. And that's the kind of music that reduces cortisol levels. Now, depending on the situation, you don't always want to do that. Sometimes you want to increase your cortisol level in order to perform at your best. Before you're going into a rock steady boxing class, which is very important to do, right? Or other high intensity interval training classes or moderate intensity exercise classes that are so crucial to slow down the progression of Parkinson's disease. You want to play a different sort of playlist. You don't want to play music that's calming. You want to get your cortisol levels up just high enough so you're performing at your peak level. So what I'm trying to say is that activation of certain areas of the brain and the brainstem at the base of the brain can powerfully impact the autonomic nervous system. That's the automatic nervous system, part of a nervous system that we don't consciously think about. And that could really impact our vital signs and our body's responses to stress and just to any other activity. So how does calming music impact it? Calming music reduces heart rate. It reduces blood pressure. It reduces anxiety. It reduces heart rate and blood pressure variability. And that's sometimes the intention of a music therapist or somebody doing a trial of a music-based intervention. In other contexts, again, I'll bring back the exercise example. You don't want to do that. So you want to play up your sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. That's the part where you're confronted with a saber-toothed tiger, and you want to either run away or you want to quickly decide, do I need to fight this predator? So your blood flow to the muscles increases, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, and there are types of music that, of course, will do that, right? So depending on the situation, you want to pick the music that will accomplish what you're seeking to do. And that really is a key theme for the talk today, that one size does not fit all. And I mean that in several ways. One is we need individual, we call it precision music medicine at our Center for Music and Medicine. We need to work together with music therapists, and most importantly with the patients. We have validated ways of getting your top 10, getting your playlist, getting your prior musical training and exposure, all of which in a very powerful way impacts the way that your specific brain, your individual brain will respond to a given piece of music. No two people will respond, or no two brains will respond to a given piece of music in the same way. That much we know for sure. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is a busy slide, but I just want to use this slide to convey the overall message that much of the brain is activated at the same time when we hear music, and especially when we sing or make music or move to music on our own. All of those dots represent large areas of the brain that fire. So that's the electrical activity and the increased blood flow that I showed in the prior slide, that fire in response to musical stimuli, to incoming sound. So to give you a little more detail, the green circles represent the basic sound pathway that music shares with language. In that sense, it's just a couple of areas. These are, by the way, cutaway images called sagittal images. So you have the right hemisphere of the brain. You're showing a cutaway on a side view, lateral or side view on the left side. And on the right side, you have a down the middle, mid-sagittal slice, it's called. So you could see kind of what's going on in the middle portion of the brain, the mid part. So you have the basic sound pathway. Then you have in turquoise a more distributed network. A network is just the dots that are the same color, they fire at around the same time, and so that's called a network. These are nodes in a neural network, and that's the network for processing the higher order features of music that make it different than language. And that's important because people who, because of certain injuries like stroke or certain neurodegenerative conditions, like Bruce Willis's primary progressive aphasia, for example, they lose the ability to process language in their normal way, but that doesn't automatically mean that they lose the ability to process music. And so, for people with Alzheimer's disease in particular, where this has been studied quite a lot, music stimuli are a window to access memory and to activate the brain in a way that language no longer can. Attention and working memory is in light salmon pink. And the front of the brain is here. You see my cursor, the back is here, the top is here, the bottom is here. So you have both parts in the back and in the front that have to fire together at the same time in order to make sure that we have a working attentional and network. Focusing and keeping track of music and time is important if you're really going to pay attention to it, and that really can carry over to non-musical tasks. That's kind of the general point here too. What's the goal of music therapists and music-based interventions? Well, yes, you want to make people feel better as long as they're engaged in dance or the musical activity. But if we just stop there, that really wouldn't be very much to write home about, would it? We want to make sure that there's carryover into your life, into non-music, non-dance based tasks. And that's really the challenge of doing high-powered, multi-center, large trials in order to actually prove that this carryover exists. And these trials finally are starting up. Episodic memory network is in purple. This one is especially relevant for Alzheimer's disease, of course. This is the network in purple that's devastated by Alzheimer's disease, and music can powerfully activate this network. The motor and sensory network is in dark blue. So it's interesting that you don't actually have to be dancing or moving to the music as you're listening to it or as you're making it. You have activation of your sensory parts of the brain, the feeling, the five senses, and also the motor cortex for movement. So one interesting tidbit is that, to expand on my prior point, if you have a musician and a non-musician who are otherwise the same age, match for IQ, same sex, they're listening to the same piece of music, a musician is going to have a very, very different, because this has been studied now in MRI, very different pattern of how their brain responds to the music versus how a non-musician's brain responds to music. And in short, the pattern is different in a way that the musician processes the music as a language in language-specific areas of the brain, whereas a non-musician actually processes it outside of that area, like with motor cortex activation. And then last but not least, this one is arguably the most important. In orange, you have, this is mostly on the right-hand side because these are the deep nuclei, deep nodes, parts of the brain that are involved in processing emotions and the sense of reward. So music evoked emotions, and experiencing pleasure and reward is the way that the authors of this paper, where I got this figure, are describing it. But, I would have, if I were a co-author, I would have actually tweaked this. I would have modified it to say music evoked emotions and experiencing pleasure, reward, and also negative emotions. Because what they highlight is, there's one example here at the bottom of the right-hand image. It's called the amygdala. That's the fight or flight center that activates the sympathetic autonomic nervous system very powerfully. So I'll give you an example quickly. Let's say you have two people who are of about the same age. They're hearing the same song, which they both happen to pick as their song for their first dance of their wedding. And so they're listening to this after 10 years. And one person is happily married, and the other person is hearing this song 3 years after a bitter divorce that they went through. I could predict, pretty high accuracy, that you're going to have opposite patterns of activation in this same network in orange circles. So for the person who's happily married, much more likely to have nucleus accumbens. That's really right in the middle here. Activation, as some people have heard on the call, this is the center for pleasure processing. So this is the part of the brain that lights up when we take a hit of an illicit drug. For some of us, it's chocolate. when we drink alcohol, and yes, when we hear music that we really enjoy. All the same network processed a similar way. The person who went through a bitter divorce 7 years in is not going to have nucleus accumbens activation. I'm willing to bet is going to have much more amygdala activation with negative, fearful, threatening, and negative emotions coupled with tinged with nostalgia as well. So that's another example of one size doesn't fit all. So I'm going to go a little bit faster in the interest of time because I see I want to leave time for questions. So I apologize in advance for going kind of fast. The idea that music can change the brain in lasting, measurable ways is not new. It goes back to the early 1900s. One of the founders of modern neuroscience, the Spanish scientist Santiago Ramon de Cajal, wrote this, and I quote, "Everybody knows that the ability of a pianist to play an adaptation to a new work requires many years of mental and muscular gymnastics." Now we kind of could put a number on it. You've probably heard 10,000 hour rule. To become an expert at anything, you need to put in about 10,000 hours of practice. To understand this important phenomenon, it is necessary to accept that in addition to the reinforcement of pre-established organic pathways, new pathways are created by the ramification, which means branching, and progressive growth of terminal dendritic and axonal processes. What's amazing about this quote is it was written decades before electroencephalography and nearly 100 years before MRI. So before we had the modern tools to study how music and other stimuli impact the brain, this was hypothesized and predicted in 1904 by Santiago Ramon de Cajal. All he had was his microscope looking at the brain and drawing beautifully, by the way. There's a wonderful book. It's in the background here, blurred out for me, called The Beautiful Brain, which are the drawings of Santiago Ramon de Cajal. So he received the Nobel Prize for his work. And he predicted that this was actually going to be assessed. And the pianist is changing her or his brain in measurable ways that at the time he could only guess at, but now we could actually prove it. So I mentioned the overlap between music and language. I just want to come back to that because it serves as a nice template for basically what we're doing and what music therapists are doing to get the translation from a music-based intervention into everyday life. So overall, this is again, think this is an example pertaining to speech, but this actually conceptually applies to other non-speech related applications of music-based interventions. So the benefits of music are driven by adaptive plasticity. In other words, the brain that interacts with music is changed by this interaction because the connections in the brain, those networks I showed you earlier, they are strengthened over time in specific ways depending on how somebody engages with music. So here we're talking about speech processing networks overlapping with music processing networks. And the 5 conditions that are hypothesized that need to be met for this carryover, for the lasting measurable change in the brain to be recorded are the following 5, and it's an acronym. So O stands for overlap, anatomical overlap in brain networks that process sound features used for both music and speech. P in opera is the acronym, stands for precision. Music on average places a higher demand in terms of timing processing on these shared networks compared to speech. We need to have speech has its own timing and rhythm as well. Don't get me wrong, but music generally places higher demand. In other words, we have to pay more attention with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in order to track music in time compared to language. It's less natural, especially if we are not professional musicians. E stands for emotion. Musical activities that engage these shared networks can elicit strong emotion. Notice here, it's strong emotion, but no valence. Strong positive or strong negative. Depends on the music, depends on the person. R stands for repetition. This is obvious. In order to actually have measurable changes in the brain, a single exposure to any intervention, although studies have looked at that, is not likely to have measurable change. Now, the question I often get is how long until we see a measurable change? It depends on how you set up your MRI, a functional MRI study, but some studies suggest as little as 6 to 8 weeks of exposure on a weekly basis to music can actually lead to measurable changes. In terms of structural changes, not just looking at functional MRI, what fires, but actually looking at brain volume, like is your certain areas, certain networks are getting enlarged. You could measure that too. That takes longer. depending on the intervention, it's 1 to 1.5 years. So I don't want to oversell this in any way. There isn't going to be for most people, a miraculous overnight change if you've never marched to music and then you start marching to music. Some people might feel that way, for sure, but usually to get measurable change in anything, you need to engage with that task and in a repeated fashion over time. And A in opera stands for attention. The musical activities that engage these shared networks, they have to be associated with focused attention. Again, kind of obvious. If you don't pay attention to the music or to what you're doing, you're probably not going to get the maximum benefits. So to give you some examples of neurologic music therapy or interventions, I'll just quickly define the terms. Music therapy is anything that's delivered by a licensed, trained music therapist. So there's a bachelor's program, that's a minimum. Most music therapists now have master's degrees, and a small but growing number have PhDs. Those are the leaders in the field. So those are the folks we work with. And as long as the music therapist is delivering the intervention, no matter what the intervention is, it's called music therapy. Everything else, when I play violin, if I play violin for my patients, is music medicine or type of music-based intervention. A nurse at Johns Hopkins, our music for pain program on certain units offering an iPad preloaded with music that people can actually modify, music medicine. A patient listening to their own music on their phone if they're hospitalized or outside of the hospital, that's music medicine. So music therapy is what's delivered by music therapists. Everything else is music medicine, just so the terms are not confused. So I'm going to skip some of this in the interest of time. So what are some concrete examples of what you can do and what a music therapist does? Therapeutic instrumental music performance, or TIMP. It's the initialism. Depending on what the goal is, for rehabilitation, you could optimize gross movements, so proximal movements of the arms and legs, or fine motor movements, right? Highly relevant for people with Parkinson's disease. You could, for example, aim to hit a drum or a tambourine. It could be above your eye level, below your eye level. It could be at floor level. And the instrument serves as a target of movement. And it's nice because you get immediate auditory feedback. Did you hit it in the way you intended? Is the rhythm right? Right? This is where you need to work with an instructor, with a therapist, like our drum therapist, Jason Armstrong Baker, for instance, in order to assess and hone the way that you respond. And so this is probably the best example of therapeutic instrumental music performance. You're playing music for fun and you're getting better on specific non-musical tasks. Pattern sensory enhancement is something that's often used to improve range of motion and posture. So this is simply a therapist, a musician playing a scale, ascending, descending, or getting louder or softer, crescendo, diminuendo, and then you stretch in the direction of what's being played. So up, down. The direction of movement is meant to parallel the direction of the musical line or the loudness. And so people with Parkinson's disease, for instance, have reported increased freedom of movement with this pattern sensory enhancement approach, which could increase range of motion and improve exercise tolerance and maintenance. This part I like a lot. I already talked about it, so I'll just say music-assisted relaxation is the part I was talking about, similar to resting heart rate, your decreased cortisol playlist, if you will. And we know very well that stress can exacerbate many, many, many symptoms of PD, and for that matter, pretty much all other diseases. So this is something, that you could listen to together with a care partner, and that could help relieve the care partner's stress as well. Let's not forget how important that is. So this I really don't have to tell the audience. Parkinson's disease, second most common neurodegenerative illness after AD. Lots of people living in the US not knowing about their diagnosis. Lots of people in the so-called preclinical prodromal stage, which is where the companies developing these promising disease-modifying drugs really want to intervene before people even get any symptoms. And then the four cardinal signs, once motor Parkinson's disease is diagnosed, as the TRAP mnemonic. We like mnemonics to teach the students, trainees. T for tremor, R for rigidity, muscle stiffness, akinesia, bradykinesia, slowness, loss of fine motor control and coordination, and P for postural instability. That's this cartoon here, stooped forward posture, difficulty with walking, balance, predisposing to falls. I highlighted in italics this last part P, on purpose, because compared to the treatments that we have for the other three cardinal signs, we have a lot more work to do to really get past this hurdle of postural instability, walking difficulty, and balance loss. Even our most advanced techniques, deep brain stimulation surgery, unfortunately for most patients, they do not adequately address the postural instability problem. And luckily, that's where music-based interventions have their strength. So how might music and rhythm work in Parkinson's disease? I mentioned therapeutic music performance. Singing could improve gross or fine motor skills using this concept of rhythmic entrainment. The definition is simple: patterning of our body's processes and movements to the rhythm of music. And the way it works is you get around or you strengthen the faulty pathways in the brain that we know Parkinson's disease impacts. So the everyday example that I would give you is if you're at a concert, no matter whether it's an intimate chamber performance or you're in Madison Square Garden with 60,000 other people, if the people on stage want the audience to begin clapping together, how many seconds does it take for an audience, no matter whether it's an audience of 50,000 people, to clap more or less in unison, regardless of your sense of rhythm innately? It takes seconds. And the reason it takes seconds is because our brains almost immediately align and expect for the next beat to come at a certain interval. And that sort of perception is linked across people. There are evolutionary considerations for this that we don't have time to go into, that are obviously just theorized. But it's a fact that people just line up, right? They just clap in time and it takes seconds. And it's because of this concept of rhythmic entrainment, which has been demonstrated in healthy people by electroencephalography. So if you have somebody listen to different tempi, to different paced beats, and their EEG firing patterns are analyzed, if you're hearing 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second frequency, within seconds, your EEG is going to show a peak at 1 hertz. If you're hearing 2 hertz, 2 cycles per second, 2 beats per second, they're going to go to 2 hertz immediately. But the cool thing is not even just that, but that the brain has smaller discernible spikes on EEG that are exact mathematical multiples. In music, we call that overtones or harmonics, mathematical multiples of the fundamental frequency that the sound is actually coming in at. So you have what that creates, we think, is expectation on the part of the listener of, oh, this is when the next beat is going to come. And if the next beat is syncopated, if it doesn't come as expected, then our attentional networks are tuned up, we perk up and we say, hey, where did the beat go? Part of the way the attention aspect of it works. So rhythmic auditory stimulation has been used since the 80s for walking rehabilitation. The rhythm is used as an external timekeeper. The cueing is provided by a metronome or live music or recorded music with a strong rhythm. And the idea is to engage rhythmic entrainment and allow the person to anticipate the next step. There's some emerging evidence in fairly small trials still that this may actually reduce falls, our holy grail, right, for Parkinson's disease. And this is the concept behind the device that we'll be telling you about shortly. Let me quickly tell you about just drumming. We did a small pilot study while I was still at the University of Pennsylvania in training. The controls were 10 people with Parkinson's disease that pursued their usual care, and we assessed everybody at the beginning of the study, 6 weeks later, and another 6 weeks after that. The drumming involved twice a week classes with an experienced, charismatic West African drumming instructor, and 8 out of 10 drummers, patients completed all of the 12 sessions over 6 weeks. And then we had a washout period after 6 more weeks when usual care was pursued, and we looked at a number of outcomes. The outcome that really was impressive, because this is a small study, obviously, it's a small pilot study, even though it was controlled, is we saw that quality of life, as measured by the Parkinson's disease quality of life questionnaire, significantly improved. Lower scores indicate improvement on this questionnaire after just 6 weeks of drumming, after 12 classes. And note, just as importantly, that after 6 weeks of not drumming any longer, people essentially were no longer different from baseline. So what does that tell you? well, and the controls did not have any significant changes during the same time period. What that tells you is that continued drumming is necessary to sustain demonstrated short-term benefits of this. And that's exactly why we felt it was important to have drumming community-based groups here. So without further ado, let me tell you briefly, I realize, sorry, the delay about the device. I think this would be interesting for the audience because it's actually available now. So the idea is you have sensors that go on each sneaker and each shoe. They collect information about your own individual walking pattern, 40 different gait parameters, and they feed back to essentially a phone-like device that plays the music. And based on your own walking pattern, the music changes. Either speeds up, slows down, or there's a metronome beat, rhythmic march-like metronome beat, that's automatically overlaid on top of whatever piece of music or song you're listening to. So we did a proof of concept pilot study with Boston University, published about 2 years ago, called the Tempo Study. We had 23 participants who completed about 86% of sessions. These were people on the milder side when it came to Parkinson's disease. I say this because at their baseline, we had additional sensors that they wore just for the research, not just the ones on the shoes, that assess more parameters about their walking. One of the things that was important for us here is to make it ecologically valid, aka not in the clinic, but at home. So the actual intervention was at home. People chose their preferred path. Some people chose to do indoors. Many chose to do their walking exercise outdoors, but we gave people flexibility when it came to that. And they, at baseline, averaged about 8,000 or so active steps per day. You know, the goal that at the time was talked about is 10,000 steps. So that's what I mean. They were relatively mild. They were very active, the patients, at baseline. And nevertheless, here's what we saw. The ask was, please walk 5 days a week, any days you want, for 30 minutes. The playlist that was the same for everybody, because we had to do it like that for the study before it was too individualized. The playlist was the same 30 songs, and it was 45 minutes long. So if people felt like walking longer than 30 minutes, they had that choice. We did not regulate that. We gave them the flexibility. And we found, to our pleasant surprise, that those who completed the sessions actually walked an extra 30% above our ask. So 39 minutes on average instead of the 30 minutes asked. That's very unusual for any sort of trial when people do more than asked, especially if it's something remotely exercise related. So gait speed, stride length, distance between steps, number of steps per minute increased within sessions. And this is a real important one, gait variability. The difference between how you step between left and right, which is a strong link. That measure is strongly linked to fall risk. That was reduced after 4 weeks of this pilot intervention. Increased daily moderate intensity walking improved by over 3,000 steps and 21 minutes. And I was only on the intervention days. So that's important. On the days that there was no intervention, there was no increase in walking. Quality of life improved by about 2.6 points. Walking endurance since 6-minute walk test significantly improved. Functional mobility, the 5 times sit to stand test improved as well after just 4 weeks of doing this. And very important, perhaps the most important, no adverse events reported. So far, I don't want to jinx it. All of our studies that we've published with music-based interventions have not had reported adverse events, which of course you don't expect with drug trials. So I have the moviv.com link here. Let me show you the device. This is what it looks like. Your Parkinson's specialist can now prescribe this. It's still fairly involved. I think Medicare began covering this around September, October. So still touch and go, but this is now available. And as I understand it, I think it's prescribed for a given period, I think 90 days at a time. They have a different device that was approved earlier last year in stroke called In Tandem, the In Tandem device. And this is Moviv specifically for Parkinson's disease. Same concept, but different algorithm, because this is all AI based, right? How they adapt the music. That's their secret sauce. The guitar PD study, I promise I'm getting to the end. That was a partnership with Peabody, a wonderful conservatory here, and we had a study for that that was led by professional guitar instructors. We improved mood across all participants after guitar classes, so we're twice a week. We improved from baseline to final follow-up by about 5 points in the PDQ-39 quality of life, which was a trend significance, so not significant, but close. And we improved anxiety as well after 6 weeks of group guitar classes. So this is, a group intervention. When it comes to music therapy for voice, our first study, I'm not going in chronological order here, is Parkinsonics. So that was actually the first major study that we did. And we did this at Govans Presbyterian Church on York Road. 32 participants with Parkinson's disease randomly assigned to group singing versus weekly facilitated Parkinson's disease discussion support group. So assigned readings, that kind of stuff. After 12 weeks, we crossed people over. So the singers started going to support groups and the support group folks began singing. And we looked at a number of the same outcomes I already mentioned every 6 weeks for 30 weeks. 26 out of 32 participants finished the 30-week trial. And we looked at not just at the usual assessments I already mentioned, but also objective loudness, voice outcomes. Because the theory was if we have people sing, it's training the same muscles that are involved in obviously voice production. And we know that that could be a very serious issue impacting communication and frustration levels for our patients with Parkinson's disease. So we were very heartened to see that on multiple measures, the loudness improved to a significant extent. Decibel scale of loudness is a base 10 scale. So a change of 2 decibels is actually a very significant loudness change. And at 24 weeks, which was the end of study intervention, people were asked to describe a picture for 30 seconds, a standard picture. And so it was natural speech. And then minimal volumes, which is, we looked at the range, average, minimal, and maximum. Minimal volume specifically improved as well. And that's arguably more important than any other volume because we know that the volume trails off, especially toward the end of phrases and sentences in people with Parkinson's disease. That's where the improvement was especially salient. We also found emotional well-being, body discomfort improvements, but no significant changes in other things like cognitive measures or voice-related specific quality of life. So overall, the template for how we do things at the Johns Hopkins Center for Music and Medicine is to engage local community members in our trials and assuming, based on the feedback from the same community members, aka our study participants, if it's felt that this is a useful intervention, that it is something that people enjoy, most importantly, we do our best to sponsor community-based groups outside, of course, of the realm of the trial to sustain this and make it free. So the Parkinsonics study has led to the Parkinsonics group since 2016. It's largely been on Zoom since May 2020, but as I was telling Judy before others joined, it's now making forays back into in-person. Drum PD and Drum PDHD studies led to 2 types of Zoom drumming classes began at Zoom. Now there's also an in-person class since fall of 21, and other neurological illnesses are following suit and developing this. The rhythmic auditory cueing led to a published study on the short-term effects in atypical Parkinsonian disorders, the evil cousins of Parkinson's disease. And one thing that I'm bolding and really very proud of, I mentioned to Judy briefly as well, we're partnering with multiple community stakeholders in Baltimore City to develop a dance-based exercise program for Baltimore City residents. And that's something that I would love to connect with Charlotte Stewart St. Pierre about going forward. Now, I promised that I would replay the slide at the beginning. Action steps, what you can do for yourselves now. March to music that you enjoy. Pick a playlist, easier than ever now. Enroll in a dance class. Enroll in dance class that Judy and MAPS support. Join our Parkinsonics choir online. There's an amazing program, which is a combination of singing and voice therapy called the Parkinson's Voice Project that started in the Dallas area and is now a very well-funded kind of national and rapidly global phenomenon. Pick up a musical instrument. something that you played in your youth. It's not quite the same as riding a bike, but you'd be surprised how much comes back and how quickly. Or really to challenge yourself, pick up something you've never played before. And last but not least, think about seeing a music therapist. If you reach out, I'm happy to provide the links. So to conclude, music-based interventions and music therapy may have several different kinds of beneficial effects for patients with PD and other Parkinsonian disorders. We have a lot of work to do. That's where the NIH funding comes in to clarify the mechanisms of exactly which networks are activated and how specific interventions work. We need to clarify dosing, how much music for how long, and tailored individualized interventions. And that way, obviously, you have to compare studies in order to be able to clarify what's best. But it seems that music as medicine, as a general field, is likely to grow in the coming years. And one thing I will leave you with, which for me is thrilling and very exciting, and that's really one of my career goals before I retire, to see this actually be implemented, is music-based interventions being part of social prescribing. Social prescribing as a concept involves physicians and also non-physicians when patients come in parallel, in addition to, or sometimes even instead of pharmacological interventions or surgery, we could refer somebody to the Parkinsonics choir. We could recommend they visit a museum, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder in a veteran. We have them join a drumming group. We have them attend a concert at the BSO. And the difference is, of course, we are already doing all of those things, right? The difference is instead of funding from grateful patients, which is how Center for Music and Medicine is funded over the years, we have the government, Medicare, we have that kind of funding. And in order to demonstrate that, it's going to take a lot of epidemiological work to demonstrate the cost benefit analysis, which is actually being done now. The AARP is keenly interested in this, going back almost a decade. And it is beginning to emerge, mostly out of the United Kingdom. That's where the research is coming out at a high rate. That all of these things I told you about, that's nice and it's important, arguably, but it goes actually far deeper than that. That music actually adds multiple years when all else is taken into account. Regular music exposure, attending these concerts, these community-based groups, is not just improving your quality of life, it's actually lengthening your life by years in a measurable way. So studies are beginning to show just that. The World Health Organization has a task force dedicated to this kind of study development, and there are very smart people doing this kind of work elsewhere. So my collaborators at the Center for Music and Medicine, Carrie Devlin, Q Kong, and I edited a book published about 2 years ago on music therapy and music-based interventions in neurology. And our contacts are over here. I want to thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of questions in the chat. Take my glasses off, otherwise. You mentioned that 2 times a week, music practice per week is needed to have lasting results. Do these 2 sessions need to be in the same type of practice, or could I practice an instrument in one session and possibly participate in choir in the other hour-long session?
Thank you. Thanks for reading that. So, and Karen, long time no see. We were on a Zoom call earlier this afternoon. Fantastic question. You're asking basically, can we mix and match? So as a practical, if I'm not a music therapist, but if I were wearing my music therapist hat, the answer is of course. Also, of course, you could mix and match. Also, the 2 times a week is really a convenience frequency, convenience-based frequency. If you talk to a physical therapist, which everybody with Parkinson's disease obviously needs to do on a regular basis, they often recommend a range of 1, 2, or 3 times a week. Is there a magical sweet spot there? Believe it or not, that's actually kind of open to debate. The best evidence is probably with the LSVT, Lead Silver Voice Treatment Big Program, which is 4 times a week. But as a practical matter, most therapists and I think most patients and families would not want to do 4 times a week for an hour at a time in perpetuity. That's why the program is short. It's 4 weeks, 16 sessions over 4 weeks. So generally up to a certain point, more frequent is better. We did studies, and others have published studies of once a week. The singing Parkinsonic study was once a week, so it depends on the intervention. And once a week may, in fact, be adequate to get certain types of benefits. Depends on what you're trying to get out of. Judy, just to make it easier, I'm happy to read the questions I see also.
You
So,
go right ahead. Good.
okay.
And then I've got others, but you lead
Perfect,
those
perfect.
right ahead. Great.
So Carol is asking, is music therapy known to help Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia? For Alzheimer's dementia, the answer is very clear. This is where AARP's interest and the National Institutes of Health interests are probably predominant because probably most research overall is really in this area of Alzheimer's disease. So music therapy, music-based interventions in the short term, in the long term, as an outpatient, and in assisted living facilities especially, has at this point a moderate quality evidence, which is as good or better than evidence for lots of the drugs that we're taking these days, approved by the FDA, to improve various aspects of quality of life, mood, behavior, agitation pertaining to Alzheimer's. Where the questions arise, and this is something we're studying in a trial right now, music for Alzheimer's disease, is how much cognitive benefit, if any, there is. Some studies do suggest that there is a measurable cognitive, a memory benefit, but other studies are not showing that result. So overall, it's mixed. And so there's still more work that needs to be done in Alzheimer's disease to show that. In vascular dementia, which by the way is the second most common overall cause of dementia, stroke-related dementia, there really is a dearth, a lack of studies. And while in theory, using music therapy makes sense because strokes cause interruptions in many of those networks, depending on where the strokes are that I showed you on earlier slides. And using music can help people build new connections that go around, essentially new highways that work around the areas that are damaged permanently by the stroke. So in theory, yes, it should work for vascular dementia. In practice, large studies are lacking. Now, William writes, I was one of the original participants in the Parkinsonics research project. Thank you so much, William. This is amazing. 10 years later, I am still participating. It has helped me to maintain my quality of life. It is now in person again on the second Wednesday of the month and hosted by the Charlestown Parkinson's Support Group. Thank you so much. It's not a question, but it's something much more important. William, thank you so much for participating and for sustaining this. So this is an example of 10 years later. So that goes beyond what I said about dance, but I bet you the folks that dance are still sustaining 10 years later too. Now, Judy wrote, hi, Judy. Thank you so much for joining. In our Dance for PD work, we feel that music and movement is critical, but so is the social aspect of dancing with others. Yes, we touched upon that with Judy Friedman earlier. For that reason, would joining a taiko drum group be more powerful than sitting and getting back to your own piano practice? Fantastic question. Yeah. So the pro-social aspect of music-based interventions cannot be ignored and needs to be factored in. That's exactly why when we designed the Parkinsonic singing study, we thought a long time about what the best control comparison group would be. And we thought that being in a support group where literally, people have the same reading, they're called upon in order to discuss salient topics relevant to Parkinson's disease, that it would be a very nice pro-social control. And we found that to be the case based on the participant feedback and the fact that they actually improved to a great extent on many of the same measures as well during the control group exposure. So I completely agree. It's funny they say taiko drum. I had a collaborator in Philly who was looking into the taiko drumming in particular. Arguably, yes, it would be more powerful. But again, I want to raise a caveat. So yes, music can be extremely pro-social. That's kind of the point with the rhythmic entrainment example. When people are at a concert, they're asked to clap along in rhythm. And, we all clap along and kind of dance and move to the same beat. So it's absolutely very pro-social. But some people, whether it's because of the stage of disease, practical considerations, or technical difficulties, if we're talking about group Zoom, classes. Hard to coordinate the beat there, right? Although there is a drumming class for Zoom, which has been working for a number of years now for us. Um, you could see how some people might prefer, by virtue of their personality, their Parkinson disease stage, or practical limitations, they might prefer to do something on their own. It's kind of like the example I'm thinking of is when I talk to every patient of mine about support groups. At this point, I've learned they're doing this for over a decade to preempt it by saying, look, based on the feedback from my participants, support groups are not for everybody. Some people, by dint of their personality, just don't feel like that's a good fit for them. Now, it could be the leader of the support group, it could be the makeup of the support group, but it's not for everybody. Is it for most people? Do I personally think that that's the way to go? Yes, that's why I tell about support groups and these music-based intervention groups to all my patients. But the fact of the matter is, it's still a minority, small fraction that choose to engage. Why that is, that's a subject for another talk. But overall, I agree with Judy's key point that we need to remember that music is very pro-social. And yes, for many people who are motivated, who want to get out there, glean the maximum benefit, taiko drumming might be superior to playing piano at home. But have the comparison studies of that kind of setup intervention been done? No, they have not.
Okay, I've got some more questions here that people pre-submitted. And the first one is, how does one benefit from music when one has been raised without musical literacy?
Amazing. That came up with Parkinsonics and was one of the most powerful messages that I learned. We specifically selected participants who had limited to no exposure to choir, to choral singing, to participate because we thought it would be unfair if we had people with prior choral training, some with and some without, kind of like the riding a bike comment I mentioned before. And one of the most frequent comments after screening, after like beginning the study from people was, when I was a kid, I was told that I was tone deaf. This is very poignant and very, in a way, tragic to hear for us. I was told I was tone deaf. I should not be picking up a musical instrument. I shouldn't be singing. I should focus on something else instead. Well, first of all, evidence over the last 15 to 20 years clearly points to the fact that tone deafness, if you call it that, can be trained and improved. Perfect pitch cannot be fully acquired. There is a genetic component, but better pitch, discrimination between tones, can clearly be improved and likely at any age. The earlier you do it, the better, but that's another take-home point of the talk. When I talk about neuroplasticity, changes in the brain, we now know this happens throughout our lifetime, and it happens in the face of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So even though the brain is being impacted by these diseases, you could still change it for the better, if you will, by engaging in these interventions. So I don't know if you want to elaborate. I hope that helps, that at least partially helps answer the question. So the idea is that even though you've been told that you don't have musical ability or musical literacy, first of all, if you want to take music lessons for a guitar, for example, you don't need to have musical literacy. I mean, there are bar chords that you could learn. You could just take free YouTube lessons. They'll show you the position of the fingers. You don't need to learn the notes, read sheet music, and you could learn how to play most rock music, like most Beatles songs, like I learned, for instance, with half a dozen chords. So 6 chords is all you need to play about 80% of Beatles songs passably well. So just to give you one concrete example. So you certainly don't need musical literacy to engage in this. And that's really how all of the classes that I'm talking about in the community are built. There's no prerequisite, there's no requirement going in for musical literacy. In fact, frankly, in some ways we prefer people to not have the background. Although I will tell you, we're now kind of facing the obvious that in terms of the people who are participating and are most engaged in our music therapy groups and studies do have some sort of background. And there, it's an interesting question about chicken or the egg. So do people become good, do the training and get good at music because they're predisposed to it by virtue of genetics or maybe the environment they grew up with, usually a combination? And that's why they subsequently want to engage with these music therapy, music intervention groups. Is there something, that's predisposing people genetically to become musicians? Well, the answer appears to be yes. But my point in responding to the question is that you don't have to have that genetic knack or predisposition to gain full benefits from the programs that we're doing. Where there is a very important distinction, and we have a questionnaire for that too, called the Barcelona Music Reward Questionnaire, is that some people naturally, no matter what their talent or background or training, is they don't get as much pleasure. That's that reward pathway for music. They don't enjoy, frankly, listening to music or making music as much as others. And those people probably would not be the top candidates for the types of interventions that we're talking about. But that is actually a minority of people.
Is dancing the best way to do music?
Yes. So the answer is maybe, and it depends on your preference for dance and your practical circumstances. In terms of the evidence, some of the strongest evidence is in ballroom dance, particularly Argentine tango. If you're asking me why Argentine tango versus foxtrot versus waltz, yes, studies have been done to compare those three, and Argentine tango narrowly beats them out, probably because if you've seen videos or danced Argentine tango, the steps are very large. So you're literally countering what's happening in Parkinson disease, where the steps become small, the stride length, right? And that's a key part of the essence of Argentine tango, where you have the large steps that counteract the shuffling and the reduced stride length and PD, and that's at least partly what's driving it. The other aspect of it is, I mentioned this to Judy, it takes two to tango. So where that's been studied the most at Washington University St. Louis is partnered dance. And they are following up now. Actually, they have a paper under review where they're comparing partner dance to non-partner dance within tango for Parkinson disease. And you might not be surprised to learn that those who have partner dance have specific benefits on top of the unpartnered dance. I want to highlight something, a link that Judy Sachs shared in the chat. Is this something that everybody can see and copy for themselves? It's www.socialprescribingusa.com. I wonder about the .com. I'm, of course, familiar with this website. This is an actively developing area, and we really need to join forces with the UK and other folks around the world to make social prescribing in the US a reality before I retire. And then William asks, will this program be available in a format where we can re-show it at our support group? I think that's a question for Judy. I know this was recorded, which is great.
It'll be recorded and up on the website by Friday, up on the MAPS website.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you.
Here's another question. Have you found that certain types of music, such as a particular genre, rhythm, or tempo, tend to be more effective?
Yeah, that's probably the most common question I get overall. I was waiting for that. And that I will squarely come back to my point. Precision music medicine, no panacea, no one size fits all. If you're asking me what piece of music has been studied the most, it's Mozart's Sonata for Two Pianos, Kirchhoff 448, which caused an uproar in its time in the mid to late 1990s after a publication that made its way to Nature, top cited journal in the world, somehow suggested that Mozart's music compared to silence can actually make you smarter. Well, that's of course been debunked since then. The claims were exaggerated in the lay literature. Mozart might be enjoyable for me personally. I love Mozart. I share a birthday with Mozart. Probably has something to do with it. But it's not for everybody. And so, in essence, it really is a quest that we need to undertake together. This is what the essence of music therapy is, to find the individual music-based and rhythm-based approach for a patient. So in terms of, if you're asking what's been studied the most, that's easy. That's Western classical music. But am I going to volunteer Western classical music to someone from the subcontinent of Indian heritage who is coming in and who is not familiar with it? No, I'm going to ask that person about their exposures, what they grew up with, what they enjoy listening to right now, and put together a playlist and create stimuli based on that person's cultural and the background preferences. So it's really highly individualized. It's frankly common sense, but it's hard to do these studies in a very robust way, in a rigorous way, and at the same time make them be large enough to actually detect what's better and what's better in a measurable way. I guess I would highlight therein lies the tension of what we're doing, because on the one hand, I keep talking about the precision music medicine. On the other hand, if you want an NIH funded or really any major multi-center trial, you better design an intervention that can be standardized across participants, because otherwise people are not going to fund this, right? So there's a tension there, and the way we resolve the tension is we have the same music therapists delivering the intervention, for example, in the Music for Alzheimer's trial that we've been doing for the last few years, and they meticulously document through an application on their phone what they did for every session. So it's replicable by other therapists, by people who read the manuscripts, the paper that will result from the study. And that's actually something that unfortunately has been largely missing from the field, where what the secret sauce, like what was actually done, what music was played, what was the essence of the intervention, until recently hasn't been documented in these publications in music therapy in a detailed enough way so people can actually go back and repeat it and replicate it. And in science, if you can't replicate it, it's sooner or later going to be debunked. That's what happened to the Mozart effect from the 1990s. People tried to replicate it and they couldn't. Hence, no Mozart effect.
Next one. Could you please talk about the differences and benefits to the brain and the body of dancers following non-harmonic music, like taiko drumming, for example, and harmonic music, moving to a song that evokes different emotions? Thanks.
Beautiful. So taiko drumming was brought up before in Judy's
Same person.
receptive question. I love
Same
it. I love
person.
it. Yes. So it sounds like we need to have a conversation about taiko drumming and putting together a perhaps a large multi-center trial in order to try to answer this. It's clear that rhythmic entrainment, that concept of the brain's patterns and the body's patterns aligning to the outside beat, in this case, the beat of the drum, could be a very powerful stimulus of getting people in sync with each other, of getting them to feel like part of a single collective. That would reduce cortisol levels, that would increase dopamine release, which is highly relevant to people with Parkinson's disease. And this is, in essence, why drumming is seen as an increasingly effective intervention for various symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Now, taiko drumming specifically, I think the evidence needs to be built. And that would be very interesting to do. I'm interested in kind of hearing more about how to implement this. So benefits of non-harmonic music are there in a way. From a science, wear my scientist hat. I appreciate non-harmonic interventions because if you have melody coupled with rhythm, we know that there are additional parts of the brain that the melody is going to engage. Memories that it will trigger. If it's connected to a song, then you have verbal language network activation as well. So in a sense, it's simpler as a toy problem when you're studying it to have drumming without the harmonic component. So you could isolate the rhythm-based intervention component. And the evidence is quite strong for Parkinson disease, also in stroke, also kind of less strong in multiple sclerosis, that you could have this rhythmic auditory stimulation through a device like the Moviv device and tandem device I talked about today, through a music therapist or just a care partner or the patient by themselves playing music through headphones or earbuds or in just the phone in their pocket and just walking to a beat, right? No melody, just beat. So the jury's still out in terms of what are the additional benefits of melody overlaid with the beat. So that's like what we think of traditionally as music versus just the beat by itself. And it really depends on what you're trying to study. But lots more important work to be done with this. And taiko drumming in particular, interesting to look at. The prosocial aspects cannot be denied.
Do people with Parkinson's have hallucinations?
Sorry, you broke off in the middle of the question. Something about people with Parkinson's and hallucinations?
Do they, can you hear me?
It says your network
Uh,
bandwidth is a bit low.
uh,
I'm sorry, Judy.
Michael? No?
Michael, yes. Thanks, Michael.
Michael, help.
You're muted, Michael.
Thank you. Hello.
Okay.
Okay, let's see.
Michael, can you hear me?
Oh, there we go. Maybe just
Okay.
It's
So the
better
question,
now.
muted a
so
second.
the question was, do people with Parkinson's have auditory hallucinations?
Ah, fantastic question. Michael, you're a good luck charm. Now I could hear it too. So the short answer is yes. Very interesting topic. For those interested in delving into this more, I recommend the wonderful book Musicophilia by our collective hero in neurology, Oliver Sacks. Musicophilia, who talks about auditory hallucinations, among many other interesting phenomena. I do have patients without Parkinson's disease who come to me complaining of musical hallucinations. It turns out in recent literature that auditory hallucinations and musical hallucinations specifically are actually a heck of a lot more frequent than previously thought. In some studies, people complaining of hearing loss and ear ringing, typically they come to the ENT, otorhinolaryngology, the specialists. And in some of those clinics, if you ask, are you actually hearing music? Are you hearing something beyond just plain ear ringing? It's up to 25% of the patient population. But lots of times, unfortunately, people are embarrassed to talk about it. So it's actually a much more common phenomenon than previously thought in the general population. It's tightly linked to hearing loss, just as ear ringing itself, tinnitus. And in people with Parkinson's disease, of course, that's no exception. There are emerging studies showing that the inner ear and hearing, aspects of hearing, are impacted in people with Parkinson's disease more than you expect from age-matched people without PD. So, absolutely, I have multiple patients with musical hallucinations to PD. If they are pleasant music, then I don't treat it. If they're unpleasant, then there are medications that we could use in order to make them go away or at least dampen them, usually with a moderate amount of success. So, yes, is it common in terms of studies reported in Parkinson's disease? No. Among my, I guess, 750 to 800 patients with PD, probably I could count on one hand the number of people who've complained of bothersome musical hallucinations. But I have to admit, even though I'm the director of the Center for Music and Medicine, I don't systematically ask people, so they would have to volunteer this information. I guess I do ask in the sense that I always screen for hallucinations generally. So at that point, it's up to the person to say, yes, I'm hearing music. But it's really on one hand, number of people I could name. But yeah, it happens. It happens without Parkinson's disease. It's associated with hearing loss. It usually goes away if the hearing loss is corrected with appropriate hearing aids. But if that is not feasible, not workable, is not happening, then medications could be helpful.
Why and how does music improve motor symptoms of people with Parkinson's?
I think this is one of the questions before the talk, right?
Yeah.
That would be a wonderful thing. I should have put that into my objectives. That was really the topic of the talk. The basic idea in a nutshell, um, why and how. Why is because if it's appropriately picked, if it's appropriately selected, the music is fun, and that makes it sustainable over time. That's arguably the biggest challenge in so many patients that we treat with Parkinson's disease because the disease itself affects our motivation since it's a loss of dopamine, and motivation in the brain is subserved by dopamine. So if dopamine is low, motivation is low. The loss of mojo, right? So music can help to an extent to bring that back by releasing dopamine, the dopamine that the brain has, and doing that in a sustained manner so that people can keep coming back to the interventions that are used with music. So, exercising to music for someone with PD is highly, highly advisable, and attending music and dance exercise classes is highly advisable as well. In terms of that's the why. How is basically by getting around the pathways in the brain, the networks in the brain, the Parkinson disease affects. So there are back routes, if you will. If you imagine a brain as a series of interconnected highways, being exposed to music over time and to these rhythmic, metronome-like stimuli or drumming stimulation can help people get around it. And so one concrete example I didn't mention is what happens in Parkinson's disease even very early on, before detectable walking and balance changes are there, years before. Somebody could look like they are walking normally in the clinic. And let's say I just diagnosed them with Parkinson's disease. I showed this to a student a few weeks ago. I ask a person with Parkinson's disease who doesn't have any obvious walking disturbance to just walk again short distance while saying the days of the week backwards. Sunday, Saturday, Friday, Thursday, Wednesday, etc. What does that do? That's a dual task, right? So it requires somebody to use their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex right here in the frontal lobes, to be able to track the days, name them, right, as they're walking. Now, walking, of course, is normally an automatic thing that we don't have to think about. But in people with Parkinson's disease, years before walking is obviously disturbed, they are using additional parts of the brain, specifically those same areas in the frontal lobes, in order to normalize the walking pattern, to make it look normal. And this is a largely unconscious kind of phenomenon for most people anyway. So when you overload the frontal lobes, which are already working overtime in Parkinson's disease to normalize the walking, and you give a second task, even though it sounds simple, Sunday, Saturday, right, Friday, Thursday, the walking breaks down. Very visibly, it slows down by up to 50% in people with even early Parkinson's disease. The arm swing is lost or is reduced. The turns are slower. The stride length is shorter. All of the things that we know happen in more advanced situations with Parkinson's disease, you could bring out just by this simple dual task. So here's the kicker. When somebody does the same thing, and except the dual task is you're walking to the rhythm, to the external beat, fMRI, functional MRI studies actually show that the frontal lobe activity is gone. Now, you would think that that's not a good thing, less brain activity, but no, it's normalized. The normal activity is just in the basal ganglia, in the deep centers of the brain, with some frontal lobe connectivity in order to facilitate normal stepping, and that could be normalized by this external rhythm. Why? We don't fully have an understanding, but we think that it's because it's getting the person to process the walking through an accessory pathway through the back, which is not affected by Parkinson's disease either ever or until very late not until very late in the disease. So that's the theory in terms of how it works. But it's really neat because it's actually, the studies show reductions, less activity in the frontal lobes, and that's more normal when it comes to an automatic activity that's overlearned like walking. Another suggestion from Judy. I have another suggestion that might be useful for people who can't get into a Moviv trial. Pamela Quinn's gatekeeping app, which also allows the person with PD to select from a huge number of playlists and variable tempi, available at https://gatekeeping.co. Is this a free application? I've heard of this, but I don't know if it's free. I certainly am familiar with Pamela Quinn. That would be really good to know. She does charge. Okay, right. So, that's obviously the unfortunate limiting factor for a lot of people, but definitely worth checking out. And just to be clear, it's no longer a trial. So Moviv is not a trial. This is actually prescription based. It's still a use case in terms of Medicare approval. Letters might need to be submitted, but this is approved. This is the first in history music therapeutic device. First for stroke, second for Parkinson's disease. So hopefully more will be coming down the pipe.
Do most
Sorry, bandwidth is low.
most movement disorder specialists know about this?
No,
Oh, dear God.
98% have no idea, and the company is working on that. Sorry, can you guys
Hey,
hear me?
thank you.
Oh,
That's
okay, sure,
fast.
sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah,
I can hear you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Now you can hear me.
I can hear you
This
now.
isn't anything about music, but what are the latest studies and research on MSAP?
Oh, wow. Topic for another talk, but talk to your specialist about high dose coenzyme Q10 supplementation. CoQ10, coenzyme Q10 supplementation, 500 milligrams 3 times a day, study out of Japan, promising multiple other studies coming down the pike, including one at Johns Hopkins. Feel free to reach out. We'll talk about it. This is an antibody against alpha-synuclein from Lundbeck Pharmaceuticals called the MASCOT trial, MASCOT, MASCOT, MASCOT trial.
Okay, this is the last one.
Okay.
Again, not music. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, let's hope. 5 years post-diagnosis of my husband, dyskinesia is quite common for 40 minutes or sometimes an hour after the levodopa. It can last for about 40 minutes more. Adjustments to frequency of the levodopa have been made. Same total milligrams, but now 4 times daily instead of 3. No improvement. And I'm very worried about the potential cognitive side effects of amantadine. Yeah, it hasn't been started yet. Is it possible to start with 50 milligrams and not the standard 100? And is there any promising research that won't take 5 to 10 years until the patients can benefit?
I love it. I love it. So, yes, starting with 50 milligrams is how I do it, and that's highly advisable. Yes, amantadine after age 70, particularly, is essentially contraindicated because of the cognitive concerns, the rare but serious retinal changes in the back of the eye, so vision changes. But that's what we have. So amantadine, 50 milligrams is absolutely reasonable to start off with, and then use twice a day as necessary for the dyskinesia. In terms of what's available now, you don't have to wait for trials. If dyskinesia is a serious hindrance and an impairment to quality of life, it's time to talk to your doctor about a longer acting medication, Crexont or Rytary. And if that's not tolerated or not affordable or it's not helping the dyskinesia after adjustments, the next step is the Vyalev phospholipodopa phoscarbidopa pump. The Vyalev pump is a game changer for many patients. And one of the main reasons it's a game changer is because it could tamp down on the dyskinesias for the simple reason that you could make a much smaller adjustment with the pump in terms of the delivery of levodopa, which is also continuous as opposed to, every 3, 4 hours like the pills do. And the amount of levodopa that you're adjusting it by is much more minute. It's actually at least 3 times lower than the lowest pill increment adjustment that you could do with any of the available pills on the market. So these are some ideas. In terms of specific studies, I have to say my expertise is mostly in atypical Parkinsonian disorders, clinical trial developing, monitoring. So I'm not sure what particularly is being looked at for dyskinesia, but certainly there are things available now, which sounds like have not been tried for you based on this question, that could really reduce the dyskinesia frequency and severity, even without, hopefully, even without amantadine.
Well, that was the last question that I've got, and that's about it, I think, for this evening. So thank you very much, and I have to work together more.
I very much hope so too, Judy. Thank you for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure. Have a wonderful
Thank
night,
you.
everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Have a good night. Take care.
All right.